The only thing most of us know about the book of Daniel is that we'll find a lion's den and a fiery furnace somewhere in its chapters. The rest we tend to leave to those who use it to predict international calamities and the end times. The author of Daniel had his own problems with predictions, but the question is whether that is what Daniel is about. David de Silva shows us that the deepest material in Daniel is not about predicting the future. It's about things all too common in today's world. It's about the tendency of powerful rulers to think that they're God. It's about the brave suffering of faithful believers who know that there's only one God, and that God doesn't exchange places with anybody.
Daniel at once contains the most accessible and the least accessible material in the Old Testament. Here we find the stories of Daniel in the lion's den and the 3 youths in the fiery furnace, stories enjoyed already by my 5-year-old son. We also find visions of strange beasts, veiled predictions about the king of the north and the king of the south, and a mysterious command to hide the book. You, Daniel, keep the words secret and the book sealed until the time of the end. What are we to make of this book that combines such extremes? How are we to interpret particularly the elusive and mysterious visions in the book? Our uncertainty about how to approach this book is mirrored in the fact that Christians place Daniel among the prophets, while Jews place Daniel in the 3rd division of the Hebrew Bible, the writings. The Jewish community had a collection of prophetic books by about 200 BC. This fact is reflected in the writings of Yeshua ben Sira, a Jerusalem sage whose work dates to about 180 BC. Ben Sira composed a hymn praising the illustrious figures of Israel's history. He speaks of Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the 12, that is, the minor prophets, all in the same section, but never mentions Daniel. Descriptions of the scriptures from the 2nd and 1st century BC as the Law and the Prophets and the other books also convey the sense of a collection of prophets that is considered complete and therefore closed. The fact that Daniel was not placed among the prophets, but rather in the writings, then suggests several points. First, the Jewish community of the 2nd and 1st century BC recognized that Daniel was written after the ceasing of prophecy with Malachi. Although the book of Daniel presents itself as coming from the 6th century BC, and even provides an explanation for why it was unknown for so long, this literary setting was not taken at face value. Since it came to light after Ben Sira's time, and probably was known to have been written after that time, it was not considered appropriate to add this book to the prophets. Second, the Jewish community also recognized that, while it was unlikely that a prophet named Daniel authored the book in the 6th century BC, the book nevertheless contained an important and authentic word from God for God's people, and belonged among the sacred scriptures of Judaism. Several of the writings were read as prophecy by Jewish groups, including the early Christian movement. The Psalms, for example, which, taken at face value, do not appear to announce or describe future events or personalities at all, were interpreted as prophetic announcements concerning the history of the Qumran community, the community of the Dead Sea Scrolls, for one example. The Psalms were also understood as prophetic in terms of the significance of Jesus, the events surrounding his death and resurrection, and even his ongoing story in the realm of God. Therefore, it is not surprising that these same groups regarded Daniel as a prophet in the sense of a source of information about the triumph of God in the future. With Daniel, as with the Psalms, that prophetic reading does not represent the author's intentions or the original understanding of that literature by its audience. Rather, it represents a stage in the reinterpretation and application of those texts to new situations beyond those envisioned by the authors. Josephus, a 1st century AD Jewish historian, and the author of 4th Ezra, for example, understand Daniel's fourth beast to represent not the Greco-Syrian kingdom, but imperial Rome. Jesus appears to have used the language of Daniel 7 and 11 to predict the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. None of these uses of Daniel, however, speak to the question of what the book is, only how it continued to be used and applied by later audiences. No doubt it is this tendency that resulted in the Church's grouping of Daniel with the great prophets who were regarded by Christians as announcers of Jesus, his ministry, and the future acts of God. An astute non-Christian of the 3rd century AD named Porphyry already perceived what many biblical scholars today have come to understand. The visions of Daniel, and thus the shape of the book as we know it, date from 2nd century BC Judea, rather than 6th century BC Babylon. This view is based not on a judgment that the future cannot in principle be known or revealed in advance, but on a judgment about the accuracy of Daniel's presentations of history. The book is least accurate where it speaks of the period during which Daniel is said to have lived as a major figure in the courts of kings. It is most accurate where it describes the history of the late 3rd and early 2nd centuries. Alexander the Great's empire was divided among his 4 generals. Ptolemy, who became ruler of Egypt, and Seleucus, who became ruler of Syria, most concerned the Judean people since Palestine lay between these 2 kingdoms, and control of Palestine was the goal of many battles. In 198 BC, Antiochus III of Syria secured Palestine for himself. His son, Antiochus IV, is the archenemy of the people of God in Daniel 7 through 12. The visions there reflect the history of this period with astounding accuracy up to the time before Antiochus IV's death. At the point where the author's remembrance of the past turns to prediction of the future, namely how Antiochus IV would meet his end, the records of history show the author to have been mistaken. Antiochus did not meet his end in a westward campaign toward the Mediterranean, but deep in Persia to the east. The prophecies of Daniel are seen, therefore, as a retelling of the history of those Gentile kingdoms and rulers that have dominated Judea since Babylon, with recurring and increasing concentration on the reign of Antiochus IV. They have the form of prediction, but are really looking back at the events they describe. The time of the end, when the meaning of the book would have been crystal clear, can be accurately pinpointed to 166 to 165 BC. In these years, a reader could see in the visions the very reflection of his or her recent past and present situation. Indeed, the most illuminating books for understanding Daniel are found not in the Protestant or Jewish canons, but in the Roman Catholic and Orthodox Bible, namely 1st and 2nd Maccabees. Antiochus IV, desiring a unified kingdom, welcomed the propositions of a group of progressive Jews that Jerusalem be made over as a Greek city, ruled by Greek constitution rather than its ancestral law. Antiochus fully supported their agenda, even going as far as rededicating the Jerusalem temple to a pagan god. 1st Maccabees, like Daniel, refers to this as the desolating sacrilege, or abomination that desolates. When the local population proved uncooperative, Antiochus attempted to stamp out resistance by outlawing the observance of the Jewish law. Many are the stories of the torture and execution of faithful Jews from those years. To address the situation when loyalties were tested in the extreme, an unnamed Jew gathered together older stories about Daniel and joined them to his apocalypse, his presentation of an unfolding history of world empires that is completely in God's hand and would soon see God's justice and triumph. The stories provide examples of faithful, courageous action, The visions provide an interpretation of history in light of God's coming triumph that enables faithful, courageous action. The courage of Daniel and his three companions provide an important example and encouragement to loyalty during the time of religious persecution under Antiochus IV. No one has captured that connection better than Augustine. The same God was God of the three young men and God of the Maccabean martyrs. The former were saved from the fire, the latter were executed by fire, but both will triumph through the everlasting God. The proclamation of Daniel is the triumph of God in history. The end of the story is never human injustice or arrogance, but God's redemption of those who have sided with God's purpose, whether that deliverance should happen on this side of death, as in the tales, or on the far side of death.
If you ever have to pay a price for your faith, your courage will come from the same source that permeates the book of Daniel. It's the living God, not the bullies who briefly struck the stage, who will have the last word in history.